From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy, the German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good morning and good afternoon. A virtual warm welcome to all of you that have tuned in. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to the Berlin office's series on the German elections. Today, we're going to discuss Germany's role in Europe and in the transatlantic relationship. And we have two great speakers, both of them lawmakers, Radosław Sikorski from the European Parliament and Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill from the US House of Representatives, to discuss their perspectives on Germany's role from their neck of the woods and foreign policy priorities for Germany's next chancellor and Germany's next government. Before I hand over to my colleague, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, the Vice President and Director of the GMF's Berlin office, I'd like to encourage all of you to pose your questions to our panel. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and the questions will queue up automatically. So now I'd like to pass the mic over to Thomas. Great to have you all with us, and I hope you can join us for our next event. Thank you, Thomas. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Suda, and thank you to our panelists for being with us today. I will introduce them in a little more detail in a second. What we want to do and what this is part of is a series of convenings and events that we have in the run-up of the German elections for an English-speaking audience. We've been looking into the foreign policy elements of this from a German perspective. Now we want to turn the view around and want to look at this country and the expectations from this country, hopes, fears from outside the country, and that is what we want to do today. And we don't want to dig deep into party politics, but we want to look at the foreign policy perspective from the outside. With me today to discuss this is Representative Mikie Sherrill, member of the US House of Representatives, serving from New Jersey's 11th District. Welcome, Representative. She serves on the House Committee on Armed Services, among others, and was an Assistant US Secretary before before being elected. And we should also mention served in the Navy for 10 years, flew missions as a helicopter pilot, served the Middle East and Europe, a Russian policy officer, retired with the rank of a lieutenant. And then with us, Radosław Sikorski, member of the European Parliament, former Minister of Defense, Foreign Minister of Poland, currently affiliated with Harvard's Center for European Studies at CSIS. When we first met, he was at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. A long-term, both of you have been at GMF events. Thank you for being at this one. What we want to do is discuss for about 20-25 minutes, then as questions come in, start discussing with our audience, and I encourage everybody, you know the drill, after a year and a bit of COVID, please pose questions in the chat function, and I will try to pick several up of them and include them in the conversation. 45 minutes, and here we go. So my first question is actually to both of you, a bit of a warm-up question. How, if anything, if at all, does this German election matter from your perspective, of your country's perspective? And maybe ladies first, go with the Representative Sherrill first.
Well, thank you. And as a former helicopter pilot, it's always an honor to be on a panel with a Sikorski, even if it's spelled slightly differently. But it's wonderful to be here and such a wonderful opportunity to discuss a key state in our transatlantic relationship in Germany. And so we regard the elections as critically important. I would say even more so after our last administration here in the United States really backed away from some of the traditional support the US has provided, excuse me, for organizations like NATO and a role of strongly promoting democracy and democratic values across the world. I think Germany especially took such a leadership role in that area and continues to remain so important in our relationship. I would love to see a German government that continues to be a strong partner in promoting democratic values, that continues to promote NATO. I think it's even more important as we move into here what we think of in the United States as a different and new national defense strategy. We have been involved in small contingency land wars. We anticipate the future looks more like great power competition between with Russia and China as both peer and near peer competitors. And but we also see China as an important economic partner that doesn't really share many of our democratic values. So looking at Germany, we look to a key partner in navigating sort of these new structures in the world.
So on to Radosław Sikorski. Does it matter? And if so, how? I think we don't hear, certainly I don't hear you. You're still muted, Radek.
Before I answer your question, I'd just like to say that I can't pilot a helicopter, but in 1986, when I was in Tora Bora, when it was our base against the Soviets, I was the reporter who brought out the evidence of the arrival of Stinger missiles on the battlefield, with which we were shooting down helicopters. Soviet helicopters.
Phew.
And as regards the German election, well, in Poland, the most immediate practical question is whether if the Greens win or at least join the coalition, will they stay true to what they are saying now, and will they stop the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? That would have a material effect on Polish-American relations, on German-Russian, German-Polish, German-American. That's the most practical question.
Okay. Now, we've come with this election, an era comes to an end. 16 years of Angela Merkel, 16 years, one would argue, of a partially very successful, also stabilizing tenure, but also increasingly as viewed from other countries, and maybe the United States and Poland are two of these countries, a polarizing figure in some ways. So if you draw the line under that that era of 16 years, what's that bottom line that comes to your mind, Representative Sherrill?
It is truly an amazing era, and I know exactly how long it is because my oldest daughter was born in 2005, and so I can track that time period very particularly. And what comes to my mind is, somebody who has been a strong, stabilizing leader. Yes, right. There are certain areas where you see polarization, but from the perspective across the Atlantic, Merkel comes off as a very stabilizing force and someone who has continued through some of the difficulties we've weathered here in the US as continuing to stay the course, if you will, on some of our deeply held values. Yes, it's been difficult over those 16 years to navigate the changing face of Europe, the UK pulling out of the EU, Russia's continued promotion of, I think, kind of continued malfeasance. And we see that in some of the cyber attacks we've seen from Russia. So we do worry very much about the pipeline. We worry incredibly about Russia's plans for Ukraine and what this is going to do as they continue to try to isolate Ukraine economically. So, but from overseas, it's interesting to hear you call her polarizing, because from our country, she seems more like a stabilizing force.
Well, I mean, she was a polarizing force for Donald Trump and to part of the Republican Party. That certainly is true today. As if you go through the different issue areas, I would contend. Mr. Sikorski, from your perspective, polarizing, stabilizing.
I agree with the Congresswoman. A leadership that was more testosterone and less steady would have found it harder to manage Germany's relationships despite Germany's rising economic and political power. So I think you were very lucky to have a woman chancellor, quite frankly, for all those years. I think other leaders would be less forgiving, if you like, towards a male leader whose importance is rising so fast. I'm a tremendous fan of Chancellor Merkel because she's been, I say in Poland, the most friendly leader of Germany towards Poland since Otto III in the 11th century. Helped by the fact that she came from the East, and as a student she came to Poland, she admired our freedoms and our sort of open struggle with communism, which she couldn't pursue in East Germany. Having said that, I think I blame her for three things, which is not a lot during 16 years, apart from Nord Stream. The way she handled the euro crisis, the least possible at the last minute, I think increased the cost, not only to Greece, but also to the Eurozone. The way she decided to liquidate Germany's nuclear industry, I think has exacerbated some of our current problems with energy prices. And when the wave of refugees hit Europe in 2015, she should have called an emergency summit of the Schengen group rather than deciding on behalf of Germany, because it caused a populist backlash, at least in Poland, and probably gave our populists the 2% which enabled them to gain power. But I still think it's overall a tremendously positive legacy.
If I may want to add something, the stability that she projected out of Germany also had a stabilizing effect on Europe as a whole. And I think with a less stable Germany, we will see what the consequences or the ripple effects for countries around Germany would be without that. And no, that's notwithstanding any grievances and policy disagreements one might have on this or the other issue. Now let's draw a line under this for a second and look to the future. Even if you say, okay, this was a stabilizing element, but what about the future? Does this country have the foresight? Does it have the tools? Does it have the perspective for the challenges of the future? And what needs to change? And maybe if I want to start with member Sikorski first, with that question, what needs to change now, a bit with a twist, because your famous quote, "I fear Germany's power less than I fear her inactivity." When you translate that, I think 10 years ago, into today's world, what set of inactivities do you fear most?
I fear that we'll talk the talk of strategic autonomy, but not walk the walk. If strategic autonomy means anything, it should mean our ability to act independently in case the United States gets involved and gets sucked into its rivalry with China, with the Far East. So my question is, in that eventuality, will we be able to protect our southern perimeter at the very least, at our own expense, and can we contribute to burden sharing of the United States in that way? And secondly, will we become sufficiently autonomous in financial matters to be able to continue to trade with the world, even if the US and China mismanage their rivalry?
Congresswoman, what needs to change? Give us your wish list if you could.
Well, not surprisingly, I might have a slightly different view of my wish list, given where I sit. Certainly, I think the relationship with China and the United States is something that will be changing over the future and that we have to manage very, very carefully. I think we've seen some unhelpful shifts that took place over the past 4 years, but certainly some needs to address the economic ties to the U.S. and China. But then for the first time, we're really seeing a Chinese military growing in what we would consider a more global fashion than we've seen in the past, and an interest with the Belt and Road initiatives, and interest in areas that certainly are concerning to the U.S., especially across Latin America. And so I think what we would envision and what we would hope in a new German leadership is of course, given the geography, a focus on ensuring providing a check on any Russian malfeasance that we see, be it cyber related or as they look to maybe continue to push the borders with respect to a place like Ukraine, et cetera. But we would also expect a strong partner in navigating some of the relationship with China. I'm very concerned that we're behind on technology and how we're allowing things like Huawei to have incursions into Europe and even different areas of the US because of the complexity of many of the systems. And you think you're keeping Huawei up, but then you find there's pieces of it throughout your network. So these are, I think, challenges that, and we have this balance in all of all of our democracies are different from some of our state-run states. So what I'm talking about is the fact that you have an independent capitalist economy that is very interested in low-cost goods, and then you have your democracy promoting and government promoting democratic values with a national security input that now more than ever in the US feels separate. And we used to produce most of our technology within the defense industry. That is not the case right now. So there is this separation in how we navigate our national security and ensuring that we're competitive and that we're going forward. And also promoting these democratic values is a deep concern in the United States, and one that I think we look to Germany to be a critical partner on navigating these issues.
I think what we've just heard is already an interesting nuance. It's not a contradiction that I saw here at all, but a different emphasis. I think, Congresswoman, you emphasized the issues of great power competition. Mr. Sikorski focused on Europe's strength as a partner and a burden-sharing partner of that. Those are not contradictory, but can complement each other. But it certainly has a different sort of starting point, so to say. And that clearly has been an issue of the campaign here. Often it's a truism to say that campaigns, that elections are not being decided by foreign policy issues. Certainly this campaign, which in earnest started 3 weeks ago, has seen a lot of foreign policy debate. So far. It may not decide the election, but there's certainly a choice, especially on the issues that both of you talked about that the German electorate will have, and those are the issues discussed in this campaign. Let me ask you, because you already mentioned it, Mr. Sikorski, the greening of a German government, whatever the outcome. I think there's one thing that we can expect. We don't know for sure, but we can expect that there will be some version of a greening of German policy. And what is your, if that were to happen, what is your hope and what is your fear? Or if you don't want to put it that way, more analytically, what would you see as the consequence from your perspective of that greening, especially of foreign policy? Mr. Sikorski?
Well,
I wanted to switch around.
no. Well, look, Poland has a genuine problem with some legacy industries, with coal mining and coal generating of electricity. I talk to our colleagues in the European Parliament from the Green Party all the time, and they've been supportive. We've created a just transformation fund, which is going to help a bit. So the challenge for Poland will be the speed of that transition. And Poland is doing catch up because our nationalist government has essentially wasted 6 years imagining that this dash for lower emissions economy can somehow be ignored or stopped. And so we need some understanding of our particular historical problem, which I hope Germany will show, because after all, you are 1/4 a post-communist country too, with some lignite mines in East Germany.
So your point is about transformation, not about foreign policy per se.
Well, on foreign policy, I expect Greens to be much more European than others. I hope the new German government will start abiding by the Treaty of Lisbon, in which we pledged ourselves to have a foreign policy in common. Hitherto, Germany is freelancing, whether it's on Ukraine or in Iran, on other issues. The EU has not actually been allowed to be in the lead on anything important. And I hope that changes. I hope that people read Article 25 of the Lisbon Treaty and make their decisions and fight for their corner, obviously, at the Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels.
Now that's interesting here. Let me drill deeper on that. How has Germany been freelancing, and how would it have to stop that? And how would what it is doing, others aren't doing in Europe? Is this a German problem or is this a European problem? On Iran, I would argue there's a mechanism called 2+4 in which Germany is not freelancing. And on Ukraine, there's a mechanism called Minsk or Normandy.
Yeah, well, you can always call it a mechanism, but it means that Germany is doing the policy rather than making the policy to the EU. I mean, on Ukraine is a very good example, because Minsk excludes the United States and excludes the European Union. What business does Germany and France have to? Poland is a neighbor of both Ukraine and Russia, has a much bigger stake in Ukraine than France. And the crisis in Ukraine happened because the Ukrainians wanted an association agreement with the European Union. So when you ask me, what does stopping freelancing mean? It means Germany withdrawing from that process and telling the Russians, deal with, there was an alternative format, the Geneva format, Russia, Ukraine, EU, US, which I think is much more appropriate and would be, in fact, more effective.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Representative, greening of German foreign policy. How does that sound from a country where green is fringe, where green sounds like pacifism and and Ralph Nader, where on the other hand, we're seeing some issues that where people seem to be coming together. Climate policy with the Biden administration would seem to be one of them. So how does that sound to you?
So there's been a real shift in the United States over the past, I'd say, even just 5 years, with respect to issues related to the climate. We've had quite a few climate disasters going on in this country, wildfires in the West, tornadoes throughout the Midwest, hurricanes throughout the Gulf, that's Texas, and then up the East Coast of the United States. In my own area, we had several years ago Superstorm Sandy, which was one of our most expensive storms because it hit Manhattan. So we have, the climate deniers are having a harder and harder time here, denying that there's a problem, especially when it's happening in their own backyards, because there's just about nowhere in the United States that hasn't been hit recently by some sort of climate disaster. So there has been a movement forward. In fact, I sit on the, I'm the chairwoman of the Environment Subcommittee on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee in Congress. And what was always interesting to me was to hear Republicans sitting on my committee discussing the issues that we had to address versus what President Trump was saying. And President Trump sort of sounded like a throwback to me. He did not sound like he was in step with the rest of the Republican Party. Now, it's really hard to say right now where the Republican Party is on any number of things, but at that time he felt off. So what does that mean? Well, I look at Germany as actually really leading in areas that I think the US is starting to move into. So in my district, I have the headquarters for the German companies BASF and Evonik. It's always very interesting to meet with the CEOs of those companies and their focus on the environment in a way that feels different from when I meet with my American companies, but in a way that I hear my American companies starting to move towards. So I think green is becoming much more mainstream. And what was so interesting to me over the last 4 years was we had a president who ideologically, more than anything, seemed to want to attack policies related to the environment. That seemed to, he got a lot of pushback by American companies because they are seeing the future in green technologies. So for example, when you hear the UK saying down the road, they're not buying any more gas combustible engines, well, why would Detroit then, if they see the future, not want to start producing electric cars, right? They do, and they are, and they will. When you have California, the state in the United States, say, here's our emission policies, and the president telling all our car industry, oh, you don't have to follow emissions policies. The car companies decided to follow them because they want to sell in California. So capitalism, oddly, counterintuitively, really, to me, maybe in the past, is driving some of the green revolution here in the United States as well. And I think some of that is because of the pushes in Europe and what the Europeans are going to be purchasing in the future. We want to make here in this country. So those are some of the calculations going on. I think the more Germany pushes into that area, the more they bring the EU along with different discussions of coal. We have those same discussions here with some of our areas, but you even see a place like Texas, big oil, right? You know, for those of you who are old enough, you remember Dallas and all the soap operas at night. But now we're talking about, they call themselves the biggest energy producer. They sort of are a bit agnostic about how that energy gets produced nowadays.
So Congresswoman, what I hear you say is describing sort of the mainstreaming of greenishness, and that it's not as much of a threat as it would have been some years ago. And what I take from what you're saying is, is one thing. I'll take that back, that capitalism is driving the green revolution. Let's tell that to some
in
of
some
our
areas. I don't want to overstate.
All right.
I just want to interject.
Go ahead, sir.
And tell the Congresswoman that that series Dallas helped to bring down communism, because the communists were incautious enough to show it on our television when I lived in communist Poland in the 1970s, you know, as the life of these capitalists, and we saw it and we thought, right, well, that's what we want.
That's fantastic.
So
who knew? We've been doing patriotic duty producing the showdown.
So I'm going to go to our audience, and two unrelated or slightly related questions to Radek Sikorski, one by Patrick Chamorel from BC. So what would our old friend, we both know him, what would a greening mean to Eastern Europe? Would it mean more dependency on the United States? And a second question is a response to your freelancing remark. Isn't the current Polish government freelancing as much as Germany in terms of the EU principles on many fronts?
Well, let me start with the last. No, the current Polish government is in breach of treaties. That's not freelancing. That's just breaking the rules that we've jointly agreed in the Lisbon Treaty and other documents. They've sustained some defeats at the European Court of Justice, and I just hope that they don't dare to go against those judgments, because then we would be on the road to legal Polexit, as we call it in Poland. We have a Europhobic nationalist government whose first instinct was to collaborate closely with the United Kingdom, and we know where the United Kingdom would have led us to. So that's different from not being fully in compliance with pledges to act together in foreign policy, right? And on greening, well, for Eastern Europe, it depends who you ask, because the people of Eastern Europe want cleaner air. Something like 30 out of 50 the most polluted cities and towns in Europe are in Poland. And I know smog is a slightly different issue than CO2 emissions, but they are very much related. And so the transformation of our heating systems and of our energy sector and of our agriculture sector is in our interest. The only thing we should question is the pace of it and the sharing of the costs.
There's a question of Zachary Fernandez of the George Marshall Center in, I guess that's our friends in Garmisch. A broad question on the consequence of the election on the transatlantic relations. So what is the most urgent issue that the next German chancellor should address in transatlantic relations? And if I may expand on that a little bit, we've just seen a US president who was called Europe a trade foe, encouraged more exits from the EU, called NATO obsolete. Now there's some fixing to do, and Congresswoman, you started out by mentioning that. Now, who should do the fixing, and how should that relationship be rebalanced, restarted, especially also between the three countries of Poland, the United States, and Germany? Maybe you want to start with the Congresswoman.
Well, yeah, it's hard to lecture other countries about what their foreign policy right now as someone from the United States. But that said, I certainly think this administration cares very deeply about foreign policy. Under the previous administration, we saw, the hollowing out of our State Department, meaning the former president wasn't appointing people to positions. There was a hiring freeze at different times. A lot of jobs going unfilled. You saw the former president using our retired military members to conduct foreign policy, which as a veteran, that is something that we're not comfortable with here in the United States for a lot of different good reasons. And so seeing the current president rebuilding the State Department, rebuilding our intelligence apparatus, I remained throughout the entire Trump administration incredibly concerned about the close ties between the former administration and Russia, particularly, and the dismissal of some of our intelligence agencies and kind of a skepticism or almost a fear of our own intelligence agencies, which was very concerning. So the current president is somebody who has been engaged in foreign affairs and foreign policy for decades. He believes very deeply in that diplomacy and is, I think, going, almost just by getting elected, started to repair the relationships, I believe, because he is known to so many people throughout the world, and as a good actor on that scene. So I think we've gone a long way in a very short time to starting to repair that, although I think probably people outside the US feel like people inside the US, a little bit shaken at how quickly that devolved. So we do have work to do to strengthen our institutions here. And I think we could be helped in that endeavor by Germany and Poland and good relationships with our allies across the world. We are back on strong footing, I believe, with NATO, and it's a critical time to ensure that we have a strong NATO. I think seeing a continued promotion of that from Germany would be very helpful to repairing some of that damage. I also think it is concerning. I mean, the pipeline is very concerning. The CEO of the pipeline is somebody that Germans should well know is not trustworthy. And I have deep skepticism over some of the political maneuvers that will take place vis-a-vis especially Ukraine, and again, isolating them economically, and the future plan of Russia with respect to Ukraine concerns me. This pipeline makes it even harder. I also, when we're looking at some of the cyber hacks, I don't believe at this point that the ransom attack on our pipelines in the southeastern United States was a state-run attack, but I do believe that those were people trained within Russia, and I'm very concerned about the security as well of any sort of pipeline coming out of Russia. So I think that's probably the most immediate concern that I have.
You sure did avoid wanting to give advice to others from the United States, but I think your point about what could be done to help came across loud and clear. Now, I want to spend the next few minutes on Nord Stream 2, but want to get Radek Sikorski opportunity to respond first to the question that was posted in the chat. What is it? What is the first immediate thing for that new chancellor to do?
Well, first of all, I agree with the Congresswoman that Joe Biden, by virtue of being president, has already dissolved some of the problems that we had before. With Joe Biden, I don't fear that I will wake up and in the middle of the night, the president of the US has dissolved NATO with a tweet. I don't fear with Joe Biden that he will say that he trusts Vladimir Putin more than the FBI. And I don't fear that Joe Biden will say he will not defend Montenegro or any other NATO ally. By not doing what's outrageous, he's already repairing stuff. But I think the repairing should be on both sides, because Trump did it in his awful style, but he was right on 2%. And Germany needs to do more. It was in the last couple of years that Berlin has come into range of Russian medium-range nuclear missiles in the Kaliningrad Oblast. When it happened last time in the 1980s, you had millions of Germans in the streets. A huge, decision. Governments used to fall over stuff like that. And today, nobody is even noticing it, discussing it in Germany, and that actually is quite worrying, because it seems to suggest that Germany doesn't feel it as a threat because Russia is not a threat. You need to address this terrible Pew Research Institution poll, in which 1/3 of Germans said they would prefer for Germany to be allied with Russia against the United States. Now, attitudes like that can be shaped. Governments can explain the facts of life to the population. And lastly, I hope this is happening. Certainly my German colleagues in the European Parliament, both from CDU and from Greens, seem to be supporting the creation of an EU defense policy worthy of its name. We now have an EU defense budget. I believe we need EU defense capability, and we need a defense commission and a defense council. That, I think, is a politically acceptable way, both for Germans and for non-Germans, to strengthen Europe's posture.
That message also came across loud and clear on strategic awareness, not even having a strategy, but even having strategic awareness of what is going on, going on around you. And I agree with you. The fact that this is not even discussed here is a worrying sign. Now, I want to turn, because I don't know the number of folks who want to discuss Nord Stream 2 and what happens after the election. And I think Radosław Sikorski already mentioned his hope that the Greens will stop it. Let me provoke both of you by saying, by the time this election happens, the pipeline will be completed. And the question at that point will not be whether it will be stopped, but what will be done with it, and how a consensus can be formed between especially these three countries of the United States, Poland, and Germany, but there will be others, other European stakeholders, as well as Ukraine as a stakeholder, to form, to reduce negative fallout from it, and to form a consensus around the stuff that they agree upon strategically, how to minimize its impact. So the question here is what to do after a new German government is in place and the pipeline is completed? Question mark.
Who would you like to speak? I'm happy.
No
I've been a long-standing critic of Nord Stream because it's Germany putting its economic interest, it's the needs of its chemical industry and the desire to be the distributor of Russian gas in Europe. And that interest has trumped the overall interest of the European Union, and in particular, the interests of Central and Eastern Europe. Ukraine will be deprived of about $1.5 billion worth of revenue from gas transit fees and about 400 million each, Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And this pipeline is enabling the Russians to service their Western customers, even if they cut off the Ukraine. So it enables the possibility of energy blackmail. And
yes,
this is
let me interrupt, Mr. Stashi. Let's try not to discuss and sort of ride the horse of Nord Stream 2 to death by discussing it yet again, but rather to think along the lines of our events question, what will happen after the election.
All right, I'll tell you. The transit of Russian gas was the main source of corruption in Ukraine for the last 30 years. And this pipeline will now corrupt Germany. It has already corrupted your former chancellor. When the gas starts flowing, the flows of money will be much bigger, and your political parties, your politicians will be bribed, and your country will be corrupted with this money.
What is your answer to the question of what will need to be done post-election when the thing is finished?
Well, you can't. This is what the Russians wanted for, and you are allowing them to have it. You know, if it's completed, it will be used.
Yes.
You're not,
okay.
right, and then the gas and the money will flow. I mean, you consciously decided to do this, and you know, in Poland, I find it very difficult to make the argument for European solidarity, which I do make, when my nationalist opponents say, well, look what the Germans are doing, how selfish they are behaving. And what can I say to it? I don't have an argument.
Congresswoman, how do you explain the sanctions issue, the Biden administration's latest moves on sanctions? You mentioned the CEO of the company. What's the calculation behind that?
I'm not entirely sure. I was a little concerned to see that, given my great deal of concern with the Russian intentions through this pipeline. And I think you just heard them laid out pretty well, and the dangers now that Germany faces. I would suggest that at this point, if we're looking beyond, if we're just giving, if you're suggesting that the pipeline's a done deal and you want to move beyond the discussion of whether or not to have the pipeline and what to do about it, I would suggest at this point, the best thing Europe can do is to become energy independent in as best as possible from Russia. It's very difficult. We've mentioned, the rollback on nuclear power, which, is probably, I think, a little short-sighted. I mean, we face that decision here. We have an energy company that's divesting of fossil fuels, but we're able to do that because we have nuclear plants in the area, and they're using that as a bridge fuel at a minimum to get past some of the fossil fuels. But I do think you have to have Europe looking at new technologies and new sources of energy, because I just think it's incredibly dangerous, for the very reasons you just heard, to rely on this Russian gas. I think that is I think that's a really bad calculation, and I think it is the type of thing that we face when we have independent economies making decisions not based on national security and not based on political calculations and national security and future calculations and economic hijacking of what could happen, but based on the bottom dollar, based on profit and what that's going to look like. And I think certainly for sovereign nations, you have to have a mixture of those calculations. And because we just haven't, we're just now, I think, starting to see some of the blowback and what could happen in the future. Too many people in the US and Europe just aren't making the calculations that, it's been a little bit too, the Cold War is a little bit too far removed for this new generation. And I think they think some of these discussions are fear mongering or unlikely to happen. And yet so many of us, I think, feel very deeply that they're very likely to happen, and we need to protect ourselves from just that.
One of the beauties of these types of events is that 45 minutes is an awfully short time, but it is the appropriate time for our busy Zoom days. So this discussion is also coming to an end with the time that we had allotted. I want to thank you both, and if I were to summarize what I've just heard, is that is something that we discuss in this country a lot, is that the expectations of Germany are usually greater than its ambitions, and that gap, this conversation seems to show, is alive and kicking, and that we will have there's a set of catch-up issues to be discussed in this country. That's strategic threats, that's great power competition, and there's the lingering debate on European autonomy, on burden sharing, and on what Mr. Sikorski called freelancing. If that was that to me was sort of the package that the two of you in different ways seem to present, as seen through a pair of German eyes. And I thank you for that. I thank our audience for a whole host of questions. I will tell you most of them, maybe half of them were about Nord Stream 2. So we covered that ground in the end. And I want to also end by remarking that we will have the next of our Transatlantic Tuesday events with Cem Özdemir of the Green Party, who will try to explain to us what is green Atlanticism. That's on June 8th. Join us at that afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.